Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Thought Leaders, where we bring in leaders from various worlds of expertise. And today have a very special guest, multi-hyphenate, I feel like doesn't even cover it, but David Hansson, who's here today, and great story, great experiences. I'm really excited about talking to you about some of these things.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Of course, man. Tell us a little bit about just what you're working on nowadays before we go into the whole backstory.
Sure. So the backstory is also what I'm working on nowadays. I have been working at 37 Signals, where we make Basecamp a project management tool, and Hey, an email client, and once a new take on how to install software, web software, all the way back till 2001. So my LinkedIn page literally just has one entry under work, and it says 37 Signals. It has now been well over 20 years. I've worked together with Jason Fried, my business partner. We launched Basecamp back in 2004, before SaaS was even called SaaS, and we've been running that platform ever since, and all these other things as well. But continues to be my life's work, 37 Signals, to work on Basecamp, to work on Hey, and then to work on a bunch of open source software. I created Ruby on Rails, the web development framework used by everything from GitHub to Shopify. Even Twitter was started on it. And that was extracted out of that original application, Basecamp, back in 2004. I continued to lead that development and be very active in the forefront of web development, JavaScript, Ruby, all those things.
Got it. Um, can you tell us a little bit about just like where it all started? Like, where did this curiosity come from? I knew you came out of Copenhagen and that whole place of thought, but so where did like that technical side of things and programming like pique your interest in the very beginning? I'm sure as a kid, but what was that experience like?
Yeah, so I got my first computer when I was 6 years old, an Strada 464, I think it was called. It was one of those long bread boxes with a cassette player on the end of it. And for me, the initial fascination with computers was all about video games, all about computer games. I loved playing them. I loved discovering them. I loved back then, didn't have any money to buy them, to trade them. And I wanted to learn how to make them. So I tried to learn a few times over those early years to learn how to program, and I just didn't get it. I didn't get it when I was 6 years old. I didn't get it when I was 12 years old. I tried it once more when I was 14. It just didn't seem to stick for whatever reason. And it wasn't until the internet that I really felt I was able to create something of my own. I started working with the internet back in 95, 96, writing about video games online, but creating everything that went into a website. And I got really fascinated with how to build things for the internet. I started a bunch of gaming websites back when I lived in Copenhagen, built one thing after another. And before I knew it, I was making things in ASP.NET, in PHP. And then I teamed up with Jason Fried, who was in Chicago, Illinois at the time. I was in Copenhagen, Denmark. We had 7 time zones between us, and we found each other over the magic of the internet.
Mm,
Jason had this company, 37 Signals, that had been running a blog, Signal versus Noise. He put out a call for programmers who knew something about a problem he was trying to solve. I said, I know the answer to that. I wrote him an email. We started working together, and that really culminated in the creation of Basecamp.
yeah,
We started working that in 2003, put it out in 2004, and went all in on the software thing ever since then.
very cool. Um, Yeah, I feel like that's a lot to digest though. Like you ran through that real quick. There's so much in there, right? I mean, obviously you're introduced to technology at a very young age, around 6 years old, you mentioned. But then there was like that break. There was a kind of like a time period between that and then you said like kind of like the early 90s before you really kind of like took it a lot more seriously. And it seemed like you're more infatuated with the game side of things. And you combine that, it seems like in the mid 90s into kind of like the early stages of some of those businesses. But talk us about like just that game, like going through that gaming experience and how did it ultimately merge with the development side?
Yeah, so the fun thing about video games, really computer games, I should say, not video
Okay,
games,
got it.
computer games in the 80s,
Yeah,
was that to even load a computer game on an Amstrad 464 or a Commodore 64, which was the other popular machine at the time, you actually had to program.
yeah,
You had to write load, and then I think on the Commodore 64 it was like 8 comma star or something. That
yeah,
would start the machine loading off the cassette player. So you were dropped into a programming language as soon as you turned on the machine, which I thought just such an amazing introduction to computers that, unfortunately, to some extent, kids today are shielded from. They get an iPad, perhaps as their first computer. They get something else that's really locked down, that doesn't expose these things. Maybe they have them in some play areas. And I mean, there's plenty of good things to say about that. It was actually quite difficult to figure out how to program these machines. You didn't have YouTube. You didn't have all these other, you didn't have AI to help you out. You didn't have all of these things. But I think it gave me a relationship with the computer that was more direct. That here is a computer. I literally have to program it, even if it's only a single line of code, to start the games I want to play. And then some of the games I wanted to play were distributed in the back of magazines. They literally wrote out the source code at the back of magazines back then in the early to mid 80s. And you would literally type in the whole program. I remember doing that on Sunday morning, spending about an hour and a half typing in character by character the instructions to this game that was at the back of a magazine. And usually I'd make some spelling mistakes somewhere along the line. I couldn't make the thing work. But again, very early introduction to programming. Programming being very intimate with the idea of a computer. Nowadays, most people, they don't even think about what is a programming language, how does it work? You don't have to know those things. And that has broadened computers so much further than it ever could have if normal people had to write a small program to be able to run anything. But I also think something is lost in that. And I'm very happy, grateful even, that I grew up at the time when I did, that I got that early exposure. Computers are coming of age. I'm still introduced to it at a time where programming is an integral part of it. And it planted enough seeds of fascination with how does the computer work? What is a programming language? What do these instructions mean? I'm just typing them in mindlessly from the back of a magazine, but you pick up small things. And I think it just planted that passion that I had and carried on, fascination. I want to learn how to do this stuff. And then for whatever reason, that level of abstraction wasn't for me. I was never going to be a great assembler programmer. I was never going to be a great C programmer. That was just too low of a level of abstraction for me. But I had the urge that I wanted to be part of this. And then the internet was really the inflection point for me, because now it's not just about making games. It's also connecting to people, connecting to different continents, different countries. And then seeing that I'm able to do something here. HTML for me was the first. It's not a programming language, it's a markup language, but it felt like a programming language at the time. It felt like a way for me to make the computer do things. I have this memory of in ninth grade going to a university somewhere in Copenhagen where they let us play with computers that were connected to the internet. I think this was maybe 93, 94, probably 94. And they let us sit and make some HTML. And we would save the thing and the text on the screen would blink because I knew the blink tag. And I was like, I did that. Never mind that this was such a trivial thing to do. There's just such an immediacy and satisfaction, I think, in making the computer do something that is of your own creation. So I really got immersed in that, combined that with my love of video games, continued to write about video games, focus on my online community activities around those video games, and then slowly just learning more about how you make these things dynamic. We want to have a commenting system, for example, on our video game website. How do you do that? How do you set up a database? How do you connect it to a form where things get saved? That was when I learned ASP.NET as some of the first things, and then very quickly thereafter PHP, which I really also credit as one of those pivotal moments for me. There are a lot of different programming languages that's been around for a long time. As I said, I started out with BASIC when I wanted to play a video game. I looked at assembler, I looked at C, I looked at all the other things people were using to create video games. But PHP to me had that like one step above HTML. Like literally the first PHP I wrote would be inside the HTML. You'd just be calling database functions at the top of this HTML file. And that was just a gentle enough stepping stone that I was able to think this is something I can do, which is why even to this day, I haven't really programmed PHP in anger for damn near 25 years. Well, that's not true. 22 years, 23 years, something like that. But I have such an affinity and affection for the PHP programming language. I love that people are still pushing forward. Now there's a bunch of popular frameworks over there that's been inspired by Ruby on Rails. PHP to me was just so important because it was one file put the dynamic stuff at the top, interlace it in with the HTML, and now you have a dynamic website. I actually, seriously, continue to yearn for that initial experience. How can we make the modern way of building for the web as easy as it was in literally 99? You'd save a single file on your desktop, you would FTP it to a remote server, and then boom, everything is set up. Even Ruby on Rails, it's not that simple. I continue to look for ways, how can we compress the complexity so that we can get back to that level of simplicity. But PHP in the 90s was miles ahead of where we are today in terms of that immediacy, in terms of giving individual developers who are just starting out the power. And as I found, unless you can get over that first hurdle, unless you can get something on the screen that gives you the motivation to keep going, you're never gonna go anywhere. Very few people are. I certainly wasn't. I couldn't make the video games I wanted to make in C. I couldn't make them in assembler. It was just the wall was too tall. There was not enough guidance. Or maybe I just wasn't smart enough. But I found in PHP a way to get up there. And then I found Ruby. And that was the other inflection point. When I found PHP, it gave me the tools to make something I wanted. I didn't necessarily care that much about PHP. I was grateful for what it allowed me to do, but I wasn't like, woo, PHP, this is amazing. I was like, oh, thing I created, that's great. And then I found Ruby. And Ruby kind of merged those two things. On the one hand, I was able to create things like Basecamp that I went like, oh, this is amazing. We're making SaaS here before we even know what that term means. We're making things for the internet. And also I love it. I love making things in this language. It is awakening a whole new dimension of the endeavor for me, that I can both be full on pursuing an outcome, but I can also just thoroughly enjoy the journey. And that enjoyment eventually turned into Ruby on Rails. I took everything that I was enjoying as I was learning this programming language, Ruby. I was trying to use it to build things for the web, and I put it into one toolbox. And I put it into that toolbox both for myself. I wanted to have the toolbox when I was going to build the next thing, but also because I went like, if people see Ruby, like I've been able to see Ruby, it's going to blow their mind too. They're going to go like, I want to build in this amazing programming language that it just resonates with me. And that was one of those early moments where I've since become wiser, if you will, where I thought like anyone who sees Ruby are going to get converted right away. They're all going to want to program Ruby all day long if they make things for the internet, because Ruby is such an amazing programming language. I learned since that that's just not how it works. Like there are different people with different brains, and those brains are configured to accept different kinds of input and respond to it in different ways. I had a bunch of programming friends back before I knew how to program. They were all into assembler, they were all into C, and they were really good at those things, and I admired them for them. And then I saw that like they didn't necessarily care that much for Ruby. Like that was not the thing that ticked them. And then I also found a bunch of other folks who maybe they like Python, maybe they continue to like PHP, maybe they like Go, maybe they like other things, and that's great. But my excitement for Ruby was so intense that I felt like this feels like a secret that if more people knew it, their lives would literally be better. And thankfully, that turned out to be true. I mean, I ended up evangelizing, still continue to evangelize Ruby through Rails. And it did infect a lot of people. It did open a lot of people's minds to what programming could feel like, what it could look like, the aesthetics, that was an important thing. Even that was sort of a novel concept at the time, at least, that people would care about what the code looked like. Isn't the code just about being fast or memory efficient or producing what I want? No, it's about more than that. Or Ruby can make it about more than that. It can make it about being an art form, like a form of poetry, a conversation with a computer that you really enjoy. So, yeah.
Wow, I feel like you just rattled off a list of like life epiphanies that just started in the technical space, right? And just like and I think from, a typical like a layperson that's not in programming, not in development, right? I think there's still a large chunk of that population that has not even a surface level of understanding of any of the things that you just mentioned, and are just sitting there literally consuming things day in and day out and interacting with this technology that that they don't even know how it's in front of them, right? And that to me is kind of like you alluded to in the very beginning, but like one of maybe the pros and cons of like how there was like that challenge, but almost like a carrot with reward to like almost like an earned experience when you had to do some form of programming to get that excitement from the game, right? And that's now lost, where it's so frictionless and so easy to just consume without even having to ask how or why. And it's almost like you need, I mean, I think that's probably like the biggest thing about that's missing from where we are today, is just like that inherent curiosity of like how and why. And it's not being provoked enough, and needs to be probably provoked a little bit more, especially with a lot of the advancements that's going on now.
You can definitely remove so much friction
Mhm.
that it becomes too effortless. And when there is no effort, the payoffs are just different. You're not going to awaken the same kind of interest, or you're not going to reveal the same red thread that you can pull on. It was like, where's the invitation? Now, I'm not saying that none of this happens. I mean, even on an iPad, there's also like, hey, learn how to program, work in this little bubble over here. So it's a bit of pros and cons, but I do think to some extent that there are parts of the tech community, and I include programmers in that, that suffer from a bit of a comfort crisis, where we've gotten so removed from the functions of a computer that we can't connect to it anymore. Now, the joke, of course, is that they've been saying that since literally computers were invented, right? Like, oh, if you program in C, you're not going to know the memory registers and whatever. Like every layer of the stack will have this conversation, which is a little bit like the generational, the new generation, the young folks don't appreciate it. So there's the old man yelling at the sky kind of symptom going on. But I also do think there is something real to the idea that some part, if you care about computers, if you like computers, that some part of using the computer should have a little bit of a challenge. Is actually more interesting, it's more fulfilling, it's more meaningful if you have to struggle at least a bit. Maybe not struggle in the early phase. This is one of the things I often go back and forth with people when I discuss this topic with other programmers. It's like, should we have a big wall that basically rejects most people, and then only the people who are so motivated that they'll climb the whole wall will get over and get in, and that's maybe good? I would say, well, I hope not. I would not have become a programmer if the walls weren't low enough, as PHP made it or HTML made it, that I was able to get on. But then I want that it goes to infinity. I want the full depth. I want to keep scratching. I've been working professionally, that is paid to work with computers, for over 20 years. I would have been bored out of my mind if I couldn't keep digging deeper, if I couldn't keep learning more, if I was just repeating the same year over and over again for 20 years. I mean, then let's pluck potatoes or something.
Yeah.
I think there's just such a value in some degree of friction, some degree of discovery, some degree of adventure. And this is one of the things, I mean, I talk about this in part because I'm thinking about my current struggle, adventure, interesting, new discovery, new Linux. So I use the Mac literally since 2001. I mean, my computing era is basically divided into four, I think. I had that Amstrad 464 for I think 3 years. Then I got an Amiga. I had that for I think about 5 years. Then I got a PC that ran Windows and so on, and I had that for about 5 or 6 years. And then I had a Mac up until like 5 minutes ago. Literally from almost, I think, the second release of OS 10 or something like that back in 2001 up until spring of 2024, I was a Mac person, all in, right? And now I've discovered Linux, which obviously has been around since the 90s, and lots of other people have had lots of interesting things with. I've run it on servers for 20 years. I never ran it on the desktop. And now I discovered that joy of like, hey, here's an operating system that has a bit more friction, where you will see some of the things. Like if you actually turn off the boot screen, you will see the lines run down as it configures everything. Oh, it's getting the Wi-Fi card running. It's getting USB drivers running. It's getting all the things running. It's closer to the metal, if you will. And there's just such a real joy in that. And I went like, oh man, I kind of missed that for 20 plus years.
Interesting. You're talking about like being closer to the hardware through this kind of program, um, which makes a ton of sense. Uh, Interesting that you're going back to this older programming language and finding a new veracity in that. Um, I want to kind of, I guess, well, a couple of questions here. We'll focus on more the technical stuff, but I do want to kind of get into your racing career too, because I think it's such a contrast to, your professional, I mean, both are, you can argue both are professional career paths. But I think they're so contrasting to one another. I want to kind of understand the deeper rooted fascination with both of those worlds. But you mentioned about PHP and HTML making it like the wall was just high enough where, it wasn't like just easy for you to grasp onto it, but it also wasn't so low where it didn't present a challenge or poke at that, maybe that curiosity to have you want to learn more. Um, First, the thing I think about is like AI on the next generations to come and how that's going to potentially make things a lot easier, but also like with the right personality sets could create a certain amount of friction to want to dive into what are the mechanics behind that. What are your kind of thoughts on it? I mean, obviously it's been around for a long time, but generative AI has definitely been more mainstream in the past like year and a half or 2 years. And and with every release, we're getting something that's crazier and crazier for the general population to digest, right? Um, what are your thoughts on it? I mean, obviously you probably have seen a little bit more of the behind the curtains and how it's developed into what is now being adopted a little bit more mainstream.
I think it's just so much fun. And it's so much fun because there's so much uncertainty. No
Yeah.
one knows. Like we have all these fantasies about P Doom. We have the fantasies of AGI. It's going to do everything for everyone all the time. It's great to have those fantasies. And those fantasies may come true, but we have no clue.
Yeah.
I remember watching The Lawnmower Man, which was the first sort of mainstream movie about virtual reality in 1995. And I remember the sort of commentary as that arrived and like, oh, this is amazing. We're all going to live in virtual worlds in like 2, 3 years. It's all going to be that. Did that happen? No, it didn't. Now here we are, literally 30 years later. There's some good VR stuff. My kids are crazy about the Oculus
Yeah.
system for the games, which is actually
Yeah.
funny, full circle there, right? It's the games that are really appealing. I like the games on it too. I haven't seen anything that I need to, not even need, want to use for my daily productivity. This was one of the big claims of
Yeah.
Apple's new ski mask, that like people were going to be so excited about productivity in that. I haven't heard a lot of folks who stuck to that.
Yeah.
So sometimes we get super duper excited that there are these visions of the future that feel so close we can touch them. Another example of that is self-driving cars in the year 2017. I think that was the year Elon was like, at the end of the year, no one's going to have to own a car anymore. Robotaxi is going to drive us everywhere. And everyone from Mercedes to GM were like, yep, 18 months. Then it's like we don't need the steering wheel anymore. Also didn't happen, right? It's very hard to predict the future. Again, all of these things have moved forward. Virtual reality is so much more engrossing, so much more realistic, so much more affordable today than it was literally 30 years ago. Self-driving cars, like we're getting kind of closer. The FSD V12 Tesla and other things are like starting to feel like there's something, but the difference between it feels like there's something and we've rearranged society
Yep.
is a very large chasm. And not
Yeah.
all technologies make the jump over that chasm. It's entirely possible that AI is in that bucket. That at some point we're doing all these things and boom, we hit a ceiling and we
Mm.
can't make it do more new things. I don't know if that's going to happen. I'm thoroughly optimistic, and partly because AI to me does feel different than self-driving cars, for example. Like
Mm.
I have a Tesla. I don't actually use the self-driving function of that. It's maybe I will at some point, but up until this point, it's been a bit of a curiosity, right? I
Yeah.
use AI every day, almost every day, as part of my programming workflow. And I use it as a really patient pair programmer who knows almost all the APIs and is occasionally wrong about stuff.
Mm.
So it is essentially a tutor. Like it is someone who's teaching me how to fish. And I don't know if that's the part of AI people are most excited about. They're not necessarily excited about having a better tutor. They're excited about having someone do the work for them.
Mm-hmm.
I've not found that AI is able to do my work for me.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it speeds up some things. It helps me. It's like a better Google in many ways. It's like what Google used to be in 2005. You'd search something and you'd get this clean result that actually had the answer without all sorts of pop-ups and overlays and banners and SEO junk. AI is able to go like, yep, this is the function you want. Like, oh, okay, I could have found that Googling. It just have taken longer. Well, again, will we get to this interactive form? We're just telling the computer, I would like a program that did this. And then boom, it spits out the final thing, or it spits out something close enough. And then you're like, yeah, but I'd like it in cornflower blue. And they would just change it. And then you have your program. It's possible. It's also possible not, right? Like we have to keep that duality about every piece of technology that has not yet reached a fulfillment of our dreams in mind. And I think I think as early as the late 1950s, there were predictions by the earliest technologists that like, do you know what? General AI is a few years, maybe a decade at the most away. That was 70 years ago, right? 70 years ago, we thought it was just about 5 minutes from now. Again, AI is justifiably exciting everyone because there is something real. People are actually using it to do real things. My wife is using it to help with travel, to look things up all the time. My kids are using it to generate images. Like it's usable now in a way that, say, the self-driving cars weren't in 2017. So such an interesting time to be around computers. Like this feels like one of those frontiers in ways like the speed run of the internet. So when the internet kind of gains mainstream adoption in what, 95, 96, 97, it's sort of a slow ramp, right? Like, oh, you'd have your 60 minutes clip. This is the internet, and here's how you connect to a modem. And then people would slowly jump on it, even though, I mean, growth rates were high, but they were nothing like, say, OpenAI and ChatGPT. Like, nothing had that vertical clip. Boom, 100 million people are using it the next day. And there were plenty of people at the time who were like, yeah, do you know what? This is a fad. I think it was Krugman in 97. There was like, yeah, next year it's going to go the way of the fax machine or something. No one's going to care about it. Lots of predictions about that, which predicting the future is really hard. And like, do we need to? Could we just follow it where it goes and be excited for the things we get along the way? Like, let's imagine that AI stalls out exactly where it is right now. The models get not materially better. Wonderful. Great addition to civilization that we now have this thing. It doesn't solve all our wildest dreams, but hey, pretty good. So that's basically how I approach it. And that also means, in a business sense, I'm a little more like, I don't need to be on the barricades of this one. Like the AI dynamics, what it takes to develop AI, first of all, it's not my forte at all. Right? It's far closer, in terms of the fundamental research, is far closer to like the assembly programming, a level of abstraction either too high or too low for my mental capacity. And then okay, let's just take someone else's model and put it to use. Obviously, we need that. We need some people to do that. But I also see a lot there where you're like, that looks like something that's going to last about 3 months, and then OpenAI is going to eat it, or someone else is going to eat it. And it feels too early for me to follow the greatest piece of advice I ever got from Jeff Bezos. So Jeff Bezos owns a part of 37 Signals. And in one of the earliest conversations we had with Jeff about like, well, teach us things. We're young people in technology. Welcome to. And his admonition was, invest in the things that do not change. And his example was, no one's going to wake up tomorrow and wish packages from Amazon arrived slower. And at the time, I remember this was like 2006 or something. I think 2-day delivery was like crazy. People were like, what do you mean 2 days? That's amazing. You can get a package to someone in 2 days, right? They kept investing like billions and billions and billions over the next almost 2 decades. And now in some locales, you can literally get the thing in 2 hours.
Yeah.
And that is such a competitive edge. I mean, where I live, I can't get things in 2 hours, but I very often can get things the next day, even if I order it at 9 o'clock at night, which still blows my mind. And maybe it's actually not good for society. And maybe it's tempting all our worst impulses to get stupid little things in big boxes delivered by individuals and so on. But as a consumer experience, it's freaking amazing. And it's amazing because it's all the compound investments that Amazon has made over literally 2 decades. I think, what's the thing that's not going to change in AI? Fuck, I don't have a single answer to that one. I think it's entirely likely that everything everyone is doing, like right this second, trying to integrate AI into the thing, is going to be outdated in literally 6 months. So the kinds of investments I want to make in that, they don't fit that model. Again, right, that someone's on the frontier pushing things and so forth. it doesn't fit the investment profile I have, which is generally one that's quite conservative, which sounds perhaps weird to someone who's done startup life, if you want to call it that, who bet on early things. But this one to me seems like I don't know where to invest in ways that are high probability.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I would say the more interesting parts of it would be like on the data side and the security side, because that's going to be needed to create whatever infrastructure of whatever people want to do with it at some point. So, but yeah, super interesting. Um, would like to kind of just talk a little bit about a few things. I mean, you got into, so you got into racing. I heard you got your license in your early 20s, and you didn't like get into a race car until like mid 20s, right? So a lot of people are doing this when they're really, really young, and you did the 24-hour Le Mans, which is like freaking insane. What motivated you to do that? Because I also saw another, like, I think interview about, you've had actually obviously the career success and financial success at fairly younger ages, um and it didn't feel like you, at least what I heard, it didn't feel like it was like, now what, right? It's like you came from modest means growing up, and then you get to what you thought was going to be pinnacle of financial success, and then it's like, oh, there's not, it's not much better up here than it was before. Did that drive anything, or what is, I guess, like, what is that curiosity part for you to want to have become a race car driver? Like, and where did that start, that curiosity?
Yeah, a lot of good questions in that. So I got my driver's license to drive a regular car when I was 25. I grew
Okay.
up in Copenhagen, Denmark. I didn't need a car, couldn't afford a car. I got around the city on rollerblades, if you would believe it. So that was kind of a late start, if you will. But I did actually, connecting here to the other discussion we had, I played a lot of racing video games.
Ah,
Metropolitan Street Racer on the Dreamcast, I think in the late 90s, was one of the ones that really rank up high in my memory as a pivotal point. Forza Motorsports, the early ones that came out on the original Xbox, was one of those pivotal points. So I'd always had an fascination with fast cars. I didn't really care for commuter cars. I didn't care for transportation cars that much, but I loved Ferraris, Lamborghinis, all the sort of poster kind of cars, right? And I loved playing with them in video games. And then I get my driver's license at 25, which was also the year I moved to the United States, which was good timing because you will absolutely not do well in Chicago if you didn't have a car. Certainly not where I lived. And generally in the US, you kind of need a car. Like it is quite common unless you live in New York or someplace like
yep,
that.
yep.
Then 2 years later, company was already sort of taking off. Things were going well. I had a friend who took me to a racetrack in Chicago. I'm 27. I sit in a race car for the first time, a real race car. This was called a Formula Mazda, one of those things where you had to shift yourself and do all the things. And I do that one day. And it was almost like that inflection point in terms of mind-blowing experience that discovering Ruby was. I was like, I really, really like this. It is like a portal to the state of flow. Flow is a state where you lose track of time and place. And it's one of those stages that people often refer to when they think of your happiest moments. It is that flow state. It is when you're completely engrossed in an activity and it's slightly beyond your reach, right? Like you're trying to grasp to the next level. You don't necessarily know if you're going to do it or not, but you're constantly moving forward. That's what being in a race car for many, many years felt like. Literally every single time I jumped in the car, put on my helmet, and cranked the ignition, I would just get this sense like there's one activity, next corner, next corner, next corner. Almost like a sense of meditation, which sounds weird when you're going 200 miles an hour, that's a Zen place, but it is a very Zen place because you are completely in the now. You're completely in the present. You're not thinking about the laundry. You're not thinking about your responsibilities to someone 2 weeks from now. You're just thinking about how can I go as fast as possible and not die. So that really focuses the mind in an addictive fashion. And I became addicted to race cars. And then once I got into it, the other mode of me kicked in, which is how do I get good? What are the steps I need to take? I'd already gotten good at programming. I'd gotten pretty good at business. I'd picked up some things in marketing. I'd picked up some things in leadership. And a lot of it followed a bit of the same pattern. First, accept that you know nothing and that you suck. Beginner's mindset. There's a whole series of books around this. Then identify the people who do know things get as close as you can to them as possible, either physically or learn from them, and just become that sponge that sucks it all in. And then realize, as one of my favorite Derek Sivers essays, there is no speed limit. The standard pace is for chumps, is one of the quotes out of that essay. Where like the standard way of how long does it take someone to do something, that's the chump pace, right? Like in school, that's the average pace. How do we learn the material? Well, we set it at whatever the average is able to achieve, or maybe even slightly below that. If you're learning for yourself, learning something like driving a race car, you don't have to run that pace at all. You can just freaking crank that up to 11, just go. And that's what I did. So I jumped from series to series because I never cared to be the big fish in a small pond. I was not looking like, can I become the best regional driver in my little, no. I'm looking at how can I become like within my scope, my sphere, my class, how can I become one of the best in the world at this? Not the best. I have absolutely zero interest in becoming the best in the world at anything, because that is a completely monomaniacal obsession you need to have to become the best at something. Tremendous respect for Verstappen, right? Like literally his entire life is constant driving, and then he's on the sim, and then he's in the car, the whole thing, right? I had more things I wanted to do. I didn't actually have the discipline to do that. I didn't have the interest in doing it. But what I found is you can become very, very good at many things if you approach it with that method. That, you know what, I'm not going to stick around. I'm going to advance to the next lesson. As soon as I just almost barely grasp the current one, I'll advance. And I kept doing that. I jumped from series to series to series. And somewhere between 2007 and 2010, I went through all this. I drove a million different cars. Every single weekend was just like Saturday through Sunday, drive. And I go like, do you know what? What's the pinnacle? Where's the goal? Where we're going with this? And to me, it was the 24 Hours of Le Mans. I'd grown up in Denmark, where in the 2000s, the most winning racing driver at Le Mans of all time is a Dane named Tom Christensen, who won the race an insane 9 times in like a decade and a half or something. And obviously he's a Dane. I'm a Dane. Like there's some basic relation, like something that triggers something. And I just went, I want to do that. I want to do not what he's done. It's not like I'm going to win the race overall 9 times, but I want to be there. I want to be at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. I want to be in that kind of competition. And that's what's amazing about race cars, is that like if you're really into basketball and you start playing basketball at 25 and you become really good at basketball, you're never, ever in a trillion years going to be at the NBA finals. That's just not how that game works. Yeah. There are, again, kids who started playing basketball when they were 4 years old. They're the ones who are going to, I mean, not just that, and then dedicated their entire life to that, right? That's who's going to be at the NBA finals. In racing, it's not like that. And part of the reason it's not like that is so freaking unbelievably expensive to do that the only people who can afford to be there, generally speaking, in sports car racing is people who've already made some amount of money. The joke in racing is, how do you get a small fortune in racing? You start with a large fortune. That's how you get to a small fortune. So it required being successful at this other thing first. It required being successful at business such that I could afford to do those things. I was never going to get to the 24 Hours of Le Mans on skill alone. I got there on some skill, but also some money, and I needed to make the money first. So those kind of things converged happily at the same time. And I went to the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 2012 for the first time. I won the race in my class in 2014. And in 3 weeks, actually next week, I'm going there for my 11th run of it. So that has really just been that focal point, the sun at the center of the racing universe for me. The 24 Hours of Le Mans, the most incredible motor race in the world for me, and for about, I think, 800 million people who follow along to some degree or another over the world. It is absolutely amazing. I still get that rush of it. And it does things at a physiological level that I've not been able to replicate in any other sense. Like it's got that almost like a tiger is in front of you adrenaline pump. Like I was at a race about a month and a half ago, and I had what felt like the flu. And I was thinking like, geez, I can't do this race. Like I can't even do the practice. We're going to have to find a spare. I show up at the track. I feel like total shit. And I'm like, fuck it. Let me just get in the car. I literally get in the car. I crank the ignition and you go at 60 miles an hour to get to the end of pit lane. And when I reach the end of pit lane and I let off the pit release, that's when the car just accelerates at full pace. I went like, I feel amazing. What flu, what anything, like the way adrenaline can just suspend all other functions of your body. And it's just incredible. And it just speaks to this sense. I mean, I usually don't drive when I feel like I have the flu, but what does it then do to the rest of your mind when you are in your peak operating? It just brings you to that state of zen. When I'm driving, especially at the 24-hour Le Mans, which is my favorite racetrack in the world, I've literally done 1,000 miles around that track. It's just incredible. And it only exists, I think, 2 times a year. One for the 24 hours of Le Mans and one for a classic race, because half of the track is public road. So they literally close down half the public, and not half the road, but a big part of the roads around Le Mans. And that becomes a racetrack. And you just like, I was about to say there's no better feeling in the world. Maybe that's not true. There's no more reliable way for me to generate one of the best feelings in the world. Like literally all it takes is like be there at that track in June, get in the car, crank the ignition, drive around the track. And it's amazing. One of those peak life experiences. And that, I will say, I mean, you referenced that I wrote an article called The Day I Became a Millionaire, about some of the disappointments about making it to whatever level, like, oh, I suspect my whole life is now different. And it just isn't. It becomes Monday again. You like the things that you like. You can afford some more luxuries. A lot of luxuries they don't change your happiness in life. Let's just put it like that. You buy a nicer watch. The watch is very nice and you can appreciate its craftsmanship, but like, it's not gonna, the next day or the day after that, it's not gonna be like, oh, my life is amazing because I'm wearing an expensive fine watch. Racing to me is the one exception, the one activity of life I've been able to access that I wouldn't be able to access in that way, at least at that level, that money has enabled. Everything else we just talked about, I still love programming. I still love Ruby. I'm so excited about Linux right now. I just discovered all of that is free. I mean, or as close to free as it can come in the Western world. You need a computer that's less than $1,000 and you have access to all of that, right? It takes a little bit more than $1,000 to have access to 24 hours of law.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, I mean, very true. And you mentioned a lot of things there. I mean, I almost imagine, like, as you're explaining the race car, the first time you got into it, almost like Tron, and like you're like inside of the computer and kind of
Yes.
feel so connected to the hardware of it, right? And you're almost like one with it. And you mentioned also this idea of flow state, which I love. Has there been any other areas, what, I mean, I know like programmers sometimes get into like that Zen flow state where they're like at it for like 10, 12 hours. Did you ever feel like some semblance of that in the programming world?
Hugely. That's why I knew race cars were for me, because
Yeah,
I recognized the feeling. I recognized the flow state. I mean, I haven't done a lot of activities where I've been able to get that flow state, but one of the ones I've gotten a lot from is programming. And certainly after discovering Ruby, that was probably the thing that made it so addictive to me, that Ruby gave me a much higher rate of flow state. And being in that flow state is just such an incredible, invigorating feeling. I mean, I have not, for whatever reason, experienced or experimented a lot with drugs, but I have the sensation of that's what it feels like to have that immense rush for the first time you try MDMA or something else like that, right? Like it's just like a brain rush. And programming to me still does give me that occasionally, but I can't control it. Like it's the circumstances and the light has to be just right. And then boom, oh, Angel starts singing and the keyboard is just clattering away. Never for 10 or 12 hours, mind you. I think the longest I've ever been in flow state for programming is probably like 3 or 4 hours, 5 hours, maybe at the most. And I can't control it. I wish I could, man. I would pay literally millions of dollars if there was a pill where I could like, all right, activate flow state. And then whoosh. But that's what the race car feels like to me. It is almost like that pill, and ironically enough, also does cost a ludicrous sum of money to have access to it. But it does kind of work like that because it's sort of like it has to, because it combines the full demand of your attention with the penalty of death. Like I've never been in one of those hacker movie situations. You got to crack the firewall right now. We have 10 seconds and the earth explodes, right? I could imagine that produces sense state for some people. I have it more like, again, the light has to be just right. I'm working on a problem I've had really interesting. It doesn't happen all the time, but in the race car it does. And I think that's why for the people who get addicted to that kind of stuff is why it is so addictive, and why I think one of the things I was just talking to someone else about this morning was I've seen more and more tech folks getting into racing. George from CrowdStrike is actually running in similar circles that I am. He's doing it. We got one of the GitHub founders is getting into it. Toby from Shopify is getting into it. I think there's overlap there because all of these people know what flow state feels like, I am assuming, and then they find a way to predictably and continuously recreate it, and they're like, holy shit, that I'm on board with that. The other thing I'd say is there's the similarities there between sort of flow states for programming, but there's way more similarities than that. Race car driving is a continuous loop of optimization. You drive around a track, like to say the 24 hours of Le Mans, a lap will take 3 minutes and 30 seconds. You will get instant feedback on the things you try. Oh, we'll try to tweak the system. Maybe we try to tweak the car. Maybe I try to tweak my driving, something else like that. And you'll see, oh, I went 0.4 of a second faster. That feedback loop is also one of those loops that is highly addictive for learning, because this is the program, or the computer gives you some of that. You type some code, you hit return, you run it. Oh, it didn't work. It didn't produce the right result. It didn't go fast enough. Let me optimize a little thing, and you type away, and then boom, now it goes faster. Now it even works. The loop that you have in a race car is quite similar to that. And then beyond that, it's almost also like running a startup. So most of the racing situations I've been involved with have been with teams that come together for a season, and it's like 20-ish people who all have to mend and find out which role are they really good at, who's good enough, who's not good enough, who has the inside, who needs to be put in that role, whether there's seats and so forth. And it's kind of like I get to do a startup every year. I get to do a startup where we evaluate who's the right person and all the mechanics. You're dealing with budget constraints, you're dealing with time constraints, you're dealing with competition. You're like, it's a simulation of startup life. So all of these things together actually makes it like, I'm almost surprised that there are not more startup founders and not more programmers who have the means to get into racing who have, because I think they'd find it very relatable and exciting.
Interesting. On that note, we went way over, so I wanted to thank you for your time, and I still have a ton of questions, but we can hold off on those. And yeah, that was, I really enjoyed the connecting of the dots of the personality type as it relates back to your experience as a programmer, and then also on the racing side. I think it makes a ton of sense, especially when you talked about that feedback loop, and that coming back so instantaneously. I think a lot of, like, founders that are listening to this will understand and can appreciate that. But it's like on drugs. It's like on steroids of levels of
Yes.
of a grand scale. Awesome. Thank you again for taking the time. This was really thought provoking.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course.
All right, man.